Have you ever wondered how two high-time pilots could crash a business jet on an instrument approach? And do you find some NOTAMs confusing? And are you familiar with what you should do if you fly into an airport with a black hole approach? Today, Rob, Mark, and I will recreate the cockpit voice recorded transcript just released by the NTSB of two Falcon 20C pilots who crashed in Georgia. And it has a lot of lessons for both private and instrument pilots. Afterwards, Rob will talk about his experience flying a jet into an airport with a black hole approach. Hello and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week, we talked with DPE Seth Lake about how the FAA could make multi-engine training safer with changes to the way the VMC demo is performed. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/313. And if you're new to this show, take a moment right now, touch either the subscribe key or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And if you use the Google Podcast app, well, it's going away, and we'll talk about that after the news. But first, let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show and that we have several ways you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, and you'll find links there where you can support the show via PayPal, Venmo, the Cash App, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up in the news for the week of February 5th, 2024, a business jet crashed from flight level 200 yesterday, and we'll tell you why. A bill in Congress needs your support to limit FBO parking fees, and there was another rare crash that killed people on the ground. All this and more, and the news starts now. From sltrib.com, two dead after airplane crash near Utah-Colorado border. Two people are dead following an aircraft crash Wednesday in a remote area near the Colorado border in Grand County, according to the Grand County Sheriff's Office. According to them, the airplane, a Hawker 900XP, was en route from Grand Junction Regional Airport to Tacoma, Washington. The plane was carrying a pilot and a second-in-command. What's unusual about this crash is that this crash was doing maneuvers at flight level 200. Here's what it sounded like when this aircraft checked in with Denver approach shortly after takeoff. This audio comes from liveatc.net, and I've removed gaps in the audio to shorten the time.
Morning, departure. You've got Hawker 900 Victor Alpha heading 150, 7.4 to 14,000.
Hawker 900 Victor Alpha Denver, departure radar contact for direct proceed direct to the junction VOR.
Right turn, direct to junction VOR, Hawker 900 Victor Alpha.
Hawker 900 Victor Alpha, you're looking to do some air work once you get on center frequency?
Yes, that's correct, for, in the mid-teens for about 10 minutes.
Victor Alpha, roger. There is some lake precip in the vicinity of the junction VOR, about 10 miles in diameter. So far, it's just showing lake. Denver 900 Victor Alpha, climb maintain for level 260.
Flight level 260, Hawker 900 Victor Alpha.
Hawker 900 Victor Alpha, if you want to stop below that, just talk to Denver Center. You can contact them now, 134.5. Have a great day.
34.5, we'll see you.
After the aircraft switched to Denver Center and announced that it was beginning maneuvers, there were no further calls from the aircraft. Now, I looked at the flight track data, and to me it looks exactly like the VMC maneuver that Seth Lake talked about last week in episode 313. I mentioned in that episode that there are 2, maybe 3 of these types of accidents each year, but I've only recalled seeing them before in piston twins typically used for training. This appears to be a VMC demo accident in a Hawker jet. As the aircraft leveled at flight level 200, it had a ground speed of 280 knots. Over the next 130 seconds, the aircraft remained level at flight level 200, and the speed decreased by 113 knots from 280 knots to 167 knots. So the speed decrease was almost exactly 1 knot per second, the rate at which the FAA recommends that speed be reduced for a VMC demonstration. At 167 knots ground speed, the aircraft began turning right, the nose dropped, and the vertical descent rate went to around 10,000 feet per minute. The data appears to show the aircraft leveling off twice for a few seconds, first at 17,000 feet, and then again at 13,700 feet, though these may be anomalies in the data. The data ends with the aircraft turning to the left and descending at a high rate of speed. Now, it's possible that they were also doing either a slow flight maneuver or a demonstration of an autopilot-induced stall. And of course, our hearts go out to the families of the pilots who died in this crash. From aviation-safety.net, Grumman GA7 Cougar twin crashes in Pennsylvania. Yet another twin crash. The Grumman GA-7 Cougar, November 887 Charlie, impacted terrain shortly after takeoff from runway 29 at the Coatesville-Chester County Air Park, CTH. The pilot was killed. NTSB data shows that the aircraft was making a descending right-hand turn shortly after takeoff from runway 29. The aircraft had been hangared at Marshall Brooks Field in Michigan following a prop strike and was put up for sale. After purchase, the rebuilding work was documented on the Rebuild Rescue YouTube channel. NTSB data shows it was first test flown after repairs on December 15, 2023. It was subsequently flown to CTH. This accident was the aircraft's first flight out of CTH after it arrived. Now, I ran the flight data through simulation software. On takeoff, the aircraft was initially climbing at about 87 knots and 900 feet per minute. As it reached about 1,000 feet, which was just about 400 feet AGL, the aircraft leveled off and the speed decreased to about 75 knots. It then began turning to the right, suggesting that the right engine had failed. It stayed level for about a minute, with a ground speed slowly dropping to 60 knots. Then the aircraft started climbing briefly again, as if perhaps the engine had restarted. However, the airspeed did not increase, and the climb lasted only a few seconds. The aircraft then entered a descending right turn, dropping at about 900 feet per minute. From Reuters.com, FAA warns U.S. Congress against hiking airline pilot retirement age. The FAA administrator told Congress in a letter that lawmakers should not raise the mandatory retirement age of airline pilots to 67 from 65, saying it should first be allowed to conduct additional research. In the letter, he said, quote, "It is crucial to provide the agency an opportunity to conduct research and determine mitigations." The U.S. House in July voted 351 to 69 on an aviation reform measure that would hike the mandatory retirement age to 67. Congress last year failed to pass the FAA bill before the September 30th deadline and has voted twice to temporarily extend the agency. The current extension expires in early March. Current international rules would still prevent pilots older than 65 from flying in most countries outside the U.S. From AOPA.org, AOPA mobilizes members' pilot organizations to fight egregious FBO fees. AOPA sent a call to action to its 300,000 members, urging them to support an amendment that would ensure pilots have access to fair, reasonable, and transparent fees at public use airports. The amendment, offered by Senator Ted Budd, has garnered the support of 600 active pilot organizations as it seeks to address a growing problem with large chain FBOs that are imposing egregious parking and other fees on private pilots. AOPA has heard from thousands of pilots who are fed up with absurd fees that range from hundreds to thousands of dollars. One CFI who contacted AOPA even described a situation where they were charged an $80 parking fee for a 10-minute restroom break. Pilots who wish to see fair, reasonable, and transparent fees enforced at airports across the country should contact their senators and ask for support. And this article includes a link to senate.gov/states/statesmap.htm, which lets you send an email to your senator. And of course, there's a link to that in our show notes. From aero-news.net, geese located in the debris field of a Bell 206 crash. On January 20th, about 11:23 p.m. Central Time, a Bell 206 L-3 helicopter, November 295 Alpha Echo, was substantially damaged when it was involved in an accident near Hydro, Oklahoma. The pilot, flight nurse, and flight paramedic were fatally injured. The helicopter dropped off a patient at the Mercy Health Center heliport in Oklahoma City, and the crew was returning to their home base. The wreckage was located in an open pasture about a mile and a half east of Hydro, Oklahoma. Preliminary review of NTSB data shows they were flying between 500 and 600 feet above ground level at about 110 knots. The carcasses of several geese were located in the debris field, as well as one embedded in a flight control servo. The helicopter was retained for further examination. A review of the U.S. Air Force's Avian Hazard Advisory System found the probability of bird activity low in the vicinity of the accident. And from generalaviationnews.com, another bird story. This comes from an NTSB final report. The pilot reported he conducted a local flight in the Thatcher CX-4 aircraft. On final approach to the airport in Angier, North Carolina, about a quarter mile from the runway, he glanced down at the airspeed indicator and then glanced up, and all of a sudden a flock of birds flew into the airplane. He told investigators it was like a wall or like a machine gun going off in flight. He reported that the birds hit with the airplane, and after that point, he was a passenger. He recalled the airplane entered a stall and spin and subsequently descended and hit trees and terrain. The fuselage and wings sustained substantial damage while the pilot sustained serious injuries. Probable cause: the pilot's encounter with a flock of birds on final approach, which resulted in a loss of control, a stall and spin, and impact with trees and terrain. In other news, according to generalaviationnews.com, touch-and-goes have been banned at KTOA, the Torrance, California airport. The Torrance City Council voted 5-1 to ban touch-and-goes and restrict back taxis and low approaches at Zamperini Field in Torrance, California. In a letter to Torrance City Attorney Patrick Sullivan, AOPA cited how this ordinance conflicts with the FAA's exclusive authority to regulate airport operations and all matters of aviation safety. From avweb.com, ForeFlight announced it has designed Voyager, an advanced 3D airport application developed exclusively for Apple's $3,499 Vision Pro virtual reality goggle platform. Targeting what ForeFlight refers to as aviation enthusiasts, Voyager combines satellite imagery, high-resolution terrain, and live traffic data to bring each airport to life in 3D. From flyingmag.com, authorities in Boise, Idaho are trying to determine what caused the collapse of an airplane hangar under construction. 3 people were killed when the framework of the 39,000-foot square building gave way. 9 others were injured, and as of the following morning, 5 were listed in critical condition at Boise area hospitals. The workers were in the process of connecting structural components when something gave way, bringing down the structure and 1 crane. From verticalmag.com, Robinson Helicopter has secured FAA approval for a new empennage design for its R-44. Its design includes a symmetric horizontal stabilizer and tail cone, and it's now standard on all newly manufactured R-44s. Now, I listened to a podcast about that redesign. The company says that it will decrease the likelihood of mass bumping in its helicopters. The KI-285-2 retrofit kit, originally priced at $7,050, is available at a discounted rate of $3,600 until the end of December. And finally, from avweb.com, Bonanza crashes into home, 3 killed. The FAA reported 3 people were killed after a small plane crashed into a mobile home last week in Clearwater, Florida. According to the agency, the pilot took off from Vero Beach Regional Airport in a single-engine Bonanza V-35 before reporting an engine failure and crashing into the mobile home parked a few miles from St. Pete Clearwater International Airport. The pilot and 2 others on the ground were killed in the accident. Aviation Safety Network reported the ATC transcript shows the pilot was on approach and trying to align with runway 34 at Clearwater Air Park, that's CLW, before saying he wanted to change frequency to activate the runway lights. He then canceled IFR. Note, there is no instrument approach into CLW. I looked at the ground track and the aircraft was not aligned with the runway, but instead flew parallel to and about a half-mile south of the runway. Now that suggests to me that the pilot did not have the airport in sight, perhaps because he was late activating runway lights or had some issue trying to do that. The aircraft descended to 500 feet when it was abeam the airport. It then started a climbing left turn and climbed back up to 1,600 feet. However, it didn't fly a normal traffic pattern. The downwind was flown at an angle such that it converged with the extended center line. As it passed through the center line, it turned to a heading for a base leg, and about that time the engine quit. Moments later, the pilot returned to the frequency and reported that he was losing the engine. Following the crash, a structure fire engulfed 4 homes. The pilot was killed, as were 2 people in a mobile home. And I did want to mention how unusual it is for people on the ground to be killed in an aircraft accident. Typically, this only occurs for 1 or 2 crashes each year. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later we'll talk with Rob Mark about what both private and instrument pilots can learn from the crash of a Falcon jet in Georgia. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's get to the good news. Congratulations to John Slusser. He writes, just passed my commercial check ride, and I want to thank you for all the great help and advice. I fly an SR-20 G6 out of Torrance, California, which we just talked about during the news, and I'm a big fan of the show. I never miss an episode. John, congratulations. And I wanted to mention something that happened last weekend. I've been doing a lot of teaching in the Cirrus Vision jet, and I was at Oakland. And as I walked up, I heard that the pilot had just sent away the fuel guy who had arrived in a 100 low-lead truck. Now, the good news is that the truck driver thought there was a problem and he had been sent out there by the dispatch people, and he just didn't think it was right. So he did drive over, confirm that this was a jet and it needed jet fuel, and he went back to get the other truck. When he came back, I thanked him for noticing him and told him to keep doing the good job that he was doing. Now, when I'm traveling with a client, I always make a point to stay with the aircraft while waiting for the fuel truck. In this case, it was the first flight of the day, and I had arrived after the client had started fueling the aircraft. But when the truck arrives, I always look at the fuel label on the truck, no matter what kind of aircraft I'm in, and match it with the fuel label on the wing. I think I've mentioned before there are just 500 Vision jets out there, and already at least one of them has been misfueled. Fortunately, in that case, the pilot came back from the bathroom before the truck finished fueling the jet, but it did take hours to drain the fuel. And here's a note from Louis Robichaud. He writes, been listening for about a year, figured it was about time I joined the community and support the show. By the way, your discussion with Tom Dorrell was fantastic. Now, that would have been episode 299, which was flying tips from a military CFI for general aviation. Louis continues, it was just what I needed to hear at this point in my aviation journey. Private pilot, 500 hours, instrument rated, and I now desire to fly as a pro every single flight, even though I have no intention to fly for a profession. I'm going to let that episode simmer and listen again in a few weeks. Keep up the great work, Louis. Hey, thanks so much for sharing that with us. Glad you enjoyed it. And yes, flying like a pro is an excellent goal for all of us. We should all do that, even if we just fly for fun. And it's the little things that you want to pay attention to as well. I was in Palm Springs last week doing some training, and I kicked myself after we arrived for not remembering to prompt the owner to load the ground frequency before we landed. And although it's a tiny thing, I like to get all the tiny things right too, because if you do all of the small stuff, you're certainly not going to miss the big stuff. Speaking of Palm Springs, we parked at the Atlantic FBO, and while I was there, I saw something I have never seen before at an FBO, which was an outdoor hot tub and a swimming pool. They also had an indoor shower for cleaning up afterwards. Now, summertime temperatures can get very hot in Palm Springs, so I can imagine any pilot with a layover there would love cooling off in the pool as they were waiting for their clients to return. Anyway, just remember to pack your swimming suit. And here's a comment that was posted to YouTube. This was commenting on last week's episode about the VNC demonstrations. It was posted by Goose8494. He wrote, 36 years ago, being young and ignorant, I was subjected to the stall version of the VMC demo. I was in the back of the PA-44, which is a Seminole, while the instructor demonstrated real VMC to my colleague in the left seat. The right wing abruptly fell through perhaps 60 degrees, and I hit the ceiling during the push recovery. Some weeks later, the instructor's response may not have been as sharp, and all three on board were lost. It's still as real to me as if it were occurring yesterday. Well, that's very sad, and all I can say is, please, everyone, make sure that you're very, very careful when you're doing your flight training, especially in multi-engine aircraft. And one thing I force myself to do is, each time before I perform a VMC demo, I review the procedure step by step because I don't want to make a mistake while doing that. And here's an email from patron supporter Paris Trivity. He writes, hello, Max. I just want to drop a note and say thanks for awesome shows. I have listened to every single episode and have been a Patreon supporter since 2018. In fact, I wanted to share a new personal currency minimum I have with your listeners. It's that I catch up and listen to your latest episode before I go flying. You give useful information in every episode, and I want to make sure I have it before I go flying. That's my new personal currency minimum. Thank you, Max. Paris, that's great. Thanks for passing that along. And I want to mention that the Apple Podcast app, which I know many of you use, now supports chapters, and I'm trying to remember to include those every time that I post a new show. To access them, you need to be able to see the next episode's button located near the bottom of your screen, which has 3 horizontal lines on it with a bullet to the left of each horizontal line. If you don't see that button, look to see if you see a second play button near the bottom of your screen. The play button is a triangle. Touch that play button at the bottom of the screen or touch anywhere to the left of the play button. This brings up a second screen, and you should now see the next episode's button with its 3 horizontal lines at the bottom of the screen. Touch that next episode's button, and it should change into a button with a white background. Now look at the top of the screen, and the second line of text from the top should display the title of the current chapter that's playing. For example, right now it should say Updates. Touch the down arrow to the right of updates or whatever it says, and now you can see the full list of chapters in this episode. Touch any chapter and the podcast app will skip to that point in the episode. Hope that helps. And by the way, if you happen to be listening to us using the Google Podcast app, you need to know that app is going away. You won't be able to use the Google Podcast app after April 2nd, 2024, and you will no longer be able to migrate or export your subscriptions after June. So if that's the app you use to listen to us and you don't know what app to go to, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and on the right side of the page, click on Subscribe on Android, and you'll find a list of apps that you can consider switching to. Now, aviation is a small community, so listen and see if you know any of these people. And if you do, make sure you say hello to them and tell them you heard their name on the show. First, special thanks to Atticus Tyson. He is a new Patreon mega supporter. Now, these are the folks who sign up to donate $50 a month. And after 2 months, I send them a signed copy of one of my books. So great way to get a signed copy of my book if you'd like to do that. We also had some other people sign up on Patreon. Those include Patrick Berge, Jeff Wieland, and Ryan Rostwald. And we also have a new supporter who signed up to make a monthly payment through a PayPal, and that's Patrick Wheeler. Patrick, thank you so much. If you'd like to support the show, it's easy to do. Just go on out to aviationnewstalk.com/support. Choose which option you'd like to use to support the show, and I'll read your name on the show. Coming up next, we're talking with Rob Mark about a black hole crash that occurred in Georgia. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk about the fatal crash of a Falcon in Georgia and about what both private and instrument pilots can learn from it. The final NTSB report came out in December, and like many crashes, it paints a picture of a series of problems with the flight. Some of the factors included misreading a NOTAM about the ILS glide slope for the approach they flew, a possible misunderstanding of how to fly the ILS, which required a course reversal before turning inbound, difficulty entering the IAF, the initial approach fix, into their navigation system, arriving high and fast at the final approach fix, using airbrakes that were not permitted for use on the approach, a high descent rate on the final segment, which was flown visually, a black hole approach with virtually no lights on the ground leading up to the runway. In addition, the approach was flown in dark night conditions with both the sun and the moon below the horizon. Interestingly, the final NTSB report includes a couple of factual errors. I found it odd that it reported that both pilots had their medical exams on the same day. By digging into the docket, which holds all of the backup material, I found that the captain had his medical on January 5th, 2021, not March 10th, 2021, as listed in the final report. Also, the report said that the first officer's last flight review was in December 2021, which would have been 2 months after the crash. In fact, the flight review was done a year earlier in December 2020. Now, neither of these errors affect the substance of the report, but it's not the first time I found factual errors in a final NTSB report, so one does have to read them with a critical eye. Here's some background on the pilots. The captain was a 73-year-old male with about 12,000 hours and an ATP certificate. He had a total of 1,665 hours in make and model and had flown 56 hours in the prior 30 days. He completed multiple airman competency proficiency checks from 2019 through 2021. Each check was ultimately completed satisfactorily. However, multiple line checks required retraining and testing due to unsatisfactory performance of required task items. Some example areas that were required to be retrained and tested were circling approaches and steep turns. The first officer was a 63-year-old male with nearly 11,000 total hours and a commercial certificate. He had a total of 1,248 hours in make and model and had flown 11 hours in the prior 30 days. On December 30th, 2020, an airman competency proficiency check was completed satisfactorily with remarks that stated SIC only. The operator reported that the first officer was designated as an SIC only due to pilot performance and a lack of aeronautical decision-making and airmanship necessary to become a PIC captain. Here's in part what the final report says. On October 5th, 2021, at 5:44 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, a Dassault Falcon 20C airplane, November 283 Sierra Alpha, was destroyed when it impacted terrain near the Thompson-McDuffie County Airport, HQU, in Thompson, Georgia. The captain and first officer were fatally injured. The airplane was operated as Pac West Airlines Flight 887, DBA Sierra West Airlines, as a Part 135 on-demand cargo flight. The flight crew initiated the first flight of the night, which was about an hour in duration, at 9:32 p.m. Mountain Standard Time from their home base of El Paso International, that's ELP, and from which they flew to Lubbock, Texas. After about a 2-hour and 20-minute delay waiting for the freight on the ground, the accident flight was initiated from Lubbock to HQU. At 5:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, about 40 minutes before the crash, Pac West Flight 887 requested information from Atlanta Center about the NOTAM for the ILS Localizer Runway 10 instrument approach at HQU. Atlanta Center informed the flight crew of 2 NOTAMs, the first pertaining to the ILS Runway 10 glide path being unsurfaceable. When the controller advised the pilot of the glide path NOTAM, he stated that he did not know what GP meant, which was the abbreviation for the glide slope glide path on the approach. The second NOTAM applied to the localizer being unserviceable. The controller informed the flight crew that the localizer NOTAM was not in effect until later in the morning, after their expected arrival, which was consistent with the published NOTAM. Here's a recreation of the conversation the captain had with Atlanta Center. See if you find the conversation at all confusing. Note that there were 2 separate NOTAMs, the first for the glide slope being out of service, which was in effect for their time of arrival, and the second was for the localizer, but it wasn't to take effect until sometime after their arrival. And I've asked my good friend Rob Mark to help us with the transcript. We've got 2 different transcripts, one where there's a discussion about NOTAMs, and then later on when the aircraft is on the approach. In both of these, I'll be reading the captain's words, and he'll be reading the ATC controller. And for the second transcript, he'll also be speaking the relatively few words captured by the first officer. Rob, thanks so much for helping out here today.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, Max. I'm happy to have an opportunity to be the air traffic controller again. I haven't done that for a while.
I knew this would be a familiar role to you. And after we're done with this, I understand you've got a story you're going to share with everyone about a similar circumstance to this accident that you were involved in.
Yes, except it didn't turn out to be an accident.
Yeah, thank goodness. Well, good. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the first transcript. Atlanta Center, Platinum West 887, question.
Platinum West 887, Atlanta, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Do you have any information about the ILS Localizer 10 is out of service at a McDuffie Kilo Hotel Quebec uniform?
Platinum West 887, stand by. Platinum West 887, what was the ILS approach?
Yeah, I was inquiring about the ILS approach for runway 10.
Platinum West 887, stand by. I'm looking it up.
887, Wilco.
Platinum West 887 on the NOTAMs for Hotel Quebec uniform. There's one that says executing the navigational ILS 10 Golf Papa, but I don't know what Golf Papa means. And then / US unserviceable.
Platinum West 887, Roger.
Yeah, Platinum West, I'm looking up at the bottom of the NOTAMs, and it says the HQU ILS runway 10 localizers out of service, but it shows it starts on, the 5th at 1200, so I would assume that's in Z, correct?
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. A little confused. 2 different NOTAMs here, but it looks to me like it's still in service up until 8 or 9 o'clock.
Yeah, that's the way I'm reading it, too. It'll be out of service in 3 hours, roughly, because it's, it's 0907. So, I mean, I'm reading it, it's in service right now until 1200 Z.
Yeah, I think that's the way we read it, but thanks for looking it up for us, 887.
You're welcome.
So as you can hear from that conversation, the controller and the pilot agree that the localizer would be in service at the time of arrival, but they both seem to miss that the glide slope would be out of service. And one of the recommendations when flying a black hole approach, which is when you have few lights below you on the ground as you approach the runway, is that you must use a visual or electronic glide slope on final. Because a study done by Boeing shows that on a black hole approach, It's nearly impossible for pilots to correctly judge the correct glide path without some type of visual or electronic glide slope. In those situations, pilots often go below the glide path and crash short of the runway, which is indeed what happened to these pilots. The crash site was about 2/3 of a mile short of the runway. About 25 minutes after that initial conversation at 5:25 a.m., Atlanta Center asked PKW 887 which approach they would like, to which they responded with the ILS runway 10 approach. The controller responded, "Roger, stand by for that." Note the glide slope was out of service at the time of the accident. At 5:26, Atlanta Center cleared PKW 887 to Cedar intersection, the initial approach fix for the ILS or localizer NDB runway 10 approach. Before we get to the transcript for the last 20 minutes of the flight, let's look at the ILS 10 approach. It has just one IAF, Cedar, which also serves as the final approach fix. Cedar is an NDB, or non-directional beacon, with a 2-letter identifier AA or Alpha Alpha. To fly this approach using own navigation, also called pilot navigation, you need to fly first to Cedar and then turn away from the airport and track the localizer outbound. Then, after flying outbound for perhaps 1 or 2 minutes, you need to perform a procedured turn, which turns you around 180 degrees so that you're now flying inbound on the localizer. Then when you cross Cedar the second time, you intercept the glide slope and start descending for the airport. You might wonder, as these pilots did, whether it's possible to get vectors onto the approach. And the answer is no. Atlanta Center does not have this approach depicted on their scopes, and so they are unable to give vectors onto the approach. So the only way to fly this approach is to fly to Cedar, fly outbound, do a procedured turn, cross Cedar again, and start to descend to the DA if the glide slope is in service, or to the MDA if it's not in service. It's not at all clear that these pilots were aware that they were required to do a procedured turn, though they should have been. And that's because you can never start an approach at the FAF and turn inbound to the airport. If you're allowed to start at the FAF, because there's either a procedured turn or a hold in lieu of a procedured turn depicted, you must first turn outbound on the approach. And that's because the FAF is the start of the final segment, and you are expected to be fully stabilized when you reach the FAF, which you won't be if you join the approach at the FAF. These pilots flew direct to Cedar and turned inbound, but perhaps coincidentally, they also canceled IFR just as they reached Cedar. So they were permitted to turn inbound because they were now VFR. However, the aircraft was unstable, as you would expect if an aircraft joins an approach at the FAF. As the aircraft crossed Cedar, it flew through the localizer and remained left of the localizer for most of the remaining 90 seconds of the flight. It also crossed Cedar at 2,600 feet, but ATC had cleared them to cross Cedar at or above 3,000 feet, so they were 400 feet lower than that instruction. But had they turned outbound, they could have descended to 2,200 feet. Then, when they were inbound, they could descend to 2,000 feet, cross Cedar again, and intercept the glide slope at 1,947 feet. But this crew really set themselves up for failure. Since they canceled IFR as they reached Cedar, they weren't required to turn outbound and fly the procedured turn. Now they were 650 feet high at the FAF, as they were at 2,600 feet, while the glide slope intercept, if the glide slope had been working, which it wasn't, was 650 feet lower at 1,947 feet. Later, I'll tell you how much this increased the descent required for getting down from this higher crossing altitude. There's one other aspect to this approach. It includes a feeder fix, a NAN, which is ANNAN, which is about 8 miles southwest of the IAF Cedar. Now, in my experience, it's rare to be sent to a feeder fix. Most times I'm cleared directly to the IAF. For some reason, however, the first officer who was flying initially loaded the ILS to start at a NAN, even though we never hear ATC clear them to that fix. In fact, they are cleared direct to the IAF Cedar, a fix the crew seemed unfamiliar with. This tells me the crew was a little behind the plane and hadn't done all of their homework. Since they were expecting to fly the ILS, they certainly should have reviewed the chart and noted that the only fix on the entire approach was Cedar. But it took this crew over 5 minutes to enter Cedar. While you'd think that would be easy, there were two factors working against the crew. First, this was a very old Falcon. It was built in 1967 and was serial number 83. There's no telling how old the avionics were in the aircraft. Second, ATC cleared them to the fix Cedar and spelled it out CEDAR. But if you enter Cedar into a modern GPS, it doesn't take you to an ILS in Georgia. Instead, it takes you to a waypoint in Brazil. Since Cedar is an NDB, there are two ways to find it. One would be to use an ADF receiver, dial in the frequency of 341 kilohertz, and follow the bearing pointer to the station. But more likely, this crew was trying to enter it into a GPS. But to do that, you'd need to enter the NDB's two-letter identifier of AA or Alpha Alpha to get to Cedar. Now, this may explain why it took the crew over 5 minutes to enter Cedar. Now, I did create a software simulation of the final few minutes of the accident so that I could see what it looked like from the cockpit view, and I'll tell you what I found in that simulation after we do a voice cockpit recorder recreation, again with the help of Rob Mark. Atlanta Center, Platinum West 887, 22 descending to 15,000, heading 110.
I need that call sign one more time.
Platinum West 887.
Platinum West 887, Atlanta Center. Good morning. The Augusta altimeter is 3002, and you've got an area of heavy to moderate precipitation from your present position to the airport, really. It's somewhat parallel to your final approach. Just to verify, though, you have the Duffy weather and NOTAMs?
You're coming in pretty broken. We're going to try again, 887.
Platinum West 887, Roger. And what approach do you guys want this morning?
Requesting ILS runway 10 approach, Platinum 887.
All right, Roger. Stand by for that.
And then there's some unintelligible comments related to the checklist. And then finally, the captain says, do you want the approach checklist?
Yep. Yes.
Approach checklist, altimeter set, flight nav instruments.
Set on the right.
Set on the left.
Platinum West, when able, clear direct Cedar, then direct McDuffie.
Roger. Can you spell that fix 887? Approach checklist set. Okay.
Platinum West 887, affirmative. It's when able, direct Charlie Echo Delta Alpha Romeo. That's the initial approach fix for the 10 approach into McDuffie. So it's Cedar, then direct the airport.
Cedar, direct the airport, Platinum West 887. This is approach Platinum 887. Can we get an initial heading for Cedar for 887?
Platinum West 887, when able, with the weather, turn 15 degrees left.
15 degrees left, Platinum 887.
And Platinum West 887, pilot's discretion, maintain 11,000.
You're coming up on the altitude. Altitude. I'll get that. You fly the damn airplane. I don't want you to kill me.
And Platinum West 887, pilot's discretion, maintain 11,000.
Pilot's discretion, 11,000, Platinum West 887. I'll set up the airport. You fly the airplane. Listen, you fly, give you a heading.
Platinum West 887, pilot's discretion, maintain 3,000.
Pilot's discretion, maintain 3,000, Platinum West 887. Pilot's discretion. Okay, that's direct Cedar. That's 155 on the heading. You got it?
That's wrong.
Yeah, I'll take care of it. And approach Platinum West 887. Can we get a vector for the final approach course?
Platinum West 887, I'm unable on that. In the en route environment here, unfortunately, I don't have the approaches depicted, so I'm not allowed to vector for it.
Yes, sir. Can you spell Cedar again for Platinum 887?
Yes, sir. Let me double check in here and make sure I've got it all right. Yes, I'm showing Charlie Echo Delta Alpha Romeo, and that's for the ILS to the localizer to the runway 10 at McDuffie. That's what we're looking for, correct?
That's correct. Charlie Echo Delta Alpha Romeo.
Okay, that's correct. Yes, sir. Platinum West 887, try maybe the identifier for the NDB. I'm told it's Alpha Alpha. See if that makes sense.
Say that, spell that again for Platinum West 887.
Yes, sir. It's Alpha Alpha. Just Alpha Alpha.
Alpha Alpha, Roger. I'll fly the plane. I'll fly the airplane. You get Alpha Alpha.
Loading Alpha. I already loaded an N. How do you load an N?
Yeah, go ahead and do that.
Platinum West 887, I'm looking at the plate right here. It's right underneath the name for the NDB. It's Alpha Alpha. I'm not sure if you're seeing that on the plate or not.
You got the airplane. Yeah, we've got it now, Platinum 887.
Roger.
You got that entered. Heading direct is 070. You got to come 070.
Oh, no. Sorry.
Yeah, I got it set up here. It's check triple times. You got to go down to 3,000 feet. You got to bleed it. Now, some words were unintelligible, but included. Got to come in right speed, far out, in real low. You got to come right. Okay, you're doing something wrong here. You got to go to the right. You got to come to the right in about 20 degrees. You want crossing altitude at Cedar, the altitude 2,000, right? Watch your altitude. Altitude. Well, then you got to adjust your trim wheel. Okay, you fly the airplane. Thank you. Okay, looking good. Just a little closer, over 60 knots, wheels out. Altitude.
Platinum West 887, I'm showing you 15 miles southwest of the Cedar intersection. Cross Cedar at or above 3,000, cleared ILS localizer 10 onto Thompson McDuffie.
Okay, maintain 3,000 to Cedar, and we're clear to the ILS runway 10 approach into McDuffie, Platinum 887.
Platinum West 887, that was a good readback. It did go on guard, but I got it. Good readback. Please report back established on the procedure.
We'll report established, Platinum West 887. Thanks for your help. Okay, we can set the two, we're 13 miles, your speed checks, flaps 15.
Platinum West 887, and I don't think you're going to be able to get me there on the ground for a cancellation. And I've got a few airplanes wanting part Augusta, so I'm going to give you a phone number to call. That way you can just call us directly to cancel when you're ready, and you're still going out on guard.
Platinum West 887, ready to copy.
And Platinum West, it's Atlanta Center phone number. That number's been redacted correctly by ATC.
Okay, read back phone number. We'll call you on the ground.
Thanks, guys. And like I said, just report established on the procedure, and I'll have a frequency change for you.
Platinum West 887, roger. I don't know. Yeah, I'll get it first. Would you fly the airplane? Man, I've been doing everything else.
And then the co-pilot could be heard clicking the microphone to try and bring up the pilot control lighting.
And there's sound similar to landing gear, extending. Fly the ILS approach. And then the air brakes stowed, flaps 40 before landing list complete.
More radio clicks were heard for the pilot control lighting.
Should be coming in shortly. Follow the glide slope. Without that, Lokes alive. Speed and present heading.
Unintelligible.
Yeah. Okay, returning to flight director.
Unintelligible.
Off. I want you to fly the airplane. Okay, your speed checks, landing flap selected. And approach Platinum West 887. We've joined the localizer. We've got a visual on the runway. We can cancel IFR at this time. And they steps on another aircraft's transmission. 10 if I can cancel IFR at this time.
Platinum West 887, Roger, I have a different frequency there, but I believe you said you wanted to cancel. Is that correct?
That's affirmative, 887.
Platinum West, no traffic observed between you and the airport. Cancel IFR is received. Squawk VFR. You guys have a good morning.
Then we've got sound similar to the engine power, decreasing potentially to flight idle. Roger that, Squawk VFR. Thanks for your help. Platinum West 887.
No worries, guys.
Hey, watch your speed. You got to slow up a lot. And we're high. We're high and fast.
Sound of the engine further decreasing.
You got to lose 20 knots here. Let's use your air brakes again. McDuffie Airport Platinum 887 is on a 2-mile final runway 10 McDuffie full stop. You're way high.
No, I'm not.
Look, and you're 15 knots fast. We got a short runway. Use your air brake. Now you're low.
Sound of rapid increase in the engine power.
You got trees in here. We've got trees. Expletive. In a moment, I'll talk with Rob about his thoughts about the accident, but first, let me tell you about the consequences of crossing Cedar 650 feet high. This ILS has a glide slope of 3 degrees, which is predicated upon crossing Cedar at 1,947 feet and joining the glide slope. The accident aircraft was doing 166 knots ground speed as it crossed Cedar, so it would have needed a descent rate of 880 feet per minute if it stayed at that speed. Of course, it did slow down somewhat. It was at 130 knots at the last data point, which was 300 feet above the ground. Since it did slow, the average required descent rate would have been a little less than 880 feet per minute. However, the accident aircraft crossed Cedar 650 feet high, which meant it had to follow a 4.4 degree glide path to the runway. So at 166 knots, it needed a 1,290 or nearly 1,300 foot per minute descent to the runway. And here's what I saw in the software simulation. After crossing Cedar for about 25 seconds, the aircraft averaged a descent rate of around 600 to 700 feet per minute. But we know it needed a much higher descent rate of closer to 1,300 feet per minute. So for those first 25 seconds, the aircraft was actually getting higher above the glide slope, making their situation even worse. At about 2,200 feet, there was a decrease in engine power, and the descent rate increased to about 12 to 1,300 feet per minute. So at that descent rate, the aircraft was now paralleling the glide slope, but it was still too high. The captain then made a comment about the aircraft being high and fast. It was still at 150 knots. There was then another decrease in engine power, and the aircraft started descending at about 2,000 feet per minute, later slowing to about 800 feet per minute. At about 1,100 feet, which was just 600 feet AGL, the captain called for the use of air brakes, which was not permitted by the POH unless in icing conditions. The descent rate increased sharply to 2,200 feet per minute and then returned to about 1,200 feet per minute. The captain said, "You're way high," and the first officer, who turned out to be correct, replied, "No, I'm not," as by now the aircraft was just about on the glide slope. Just 10 seconds before the crash, the captain said, "Use your air brake," and then 5 seconds later said, "Now you're low." Impact with a tree occurred just 5 seconds later. Just to give you an idea of how unstable this approach was, during the time it was below 1,000 feet AGL, it had a descent rate exceeding 2,000 feet per minute for over 17 seconds. In those 17 seconds, below 1,000 feet AGL, it would have descended over 560 feet. So this aircraft was dropping like a rock, which highlights the perils of crossing an FAF high and fast and then trying to play catch-up by using a high descent rate at night without an electronic glide slope. You have to wonder if this crew ever considered going around. If they had, it could have saved their lives. And now here's the wrap-up conversation I had with Rob about the accident. Well, Rob, let's talk about this accident. I know you have some thoughts about it. What would you like to share with us?
I've had a situation with a black hole approach only one time in my career. Luckily, it is probably one of the scariest things I've ever experienced because you have no, I was in the right seat of a citation at the time, also going into a small airport in Georgia about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So it was very quiet, very clear night, but of course the town didn't have very many lights. So we didn't have much going for us except that we could clearly see the runway maybe 8 or 10 miles out. But of course, you have no feel for the up or down because there was no approach to this runway. And so what we knew is that in the dark, we needed to have a minimum altitude just in the back of our minds that until we were absolutely landing assured, we weren't going to go beneath a particular altitude. And then we tried to back up the approach and we kind of made up our own visual approach for the airport just to make sure that we didn't get too low. And even with Ben in the left seat calling me the altitudes, it just didn't feel right. I felt like I was flying it into the ground. And he said, no, you're fine, you're fine. And the power didn't change. We were stabilized. But boy, when I landed and I pulled the buckets into reverse and we stopped and turned off the runway, I said, man, I don't want to do that again. It was really frightening.
Yeah, black hole approaches are extremely difficult. Boeing did a study in which they showed that pilots really, unless they've got either an electronic glide slope or a VASI, typically end up crashing short of the runway. Now, in this particular case, they did not have the glide slope, which they thought they were going to have. Apparently, the PAPI was in service, but it's fairly clear that they weren't referencing it because they went below it. In fact, in the transcript, they never mentioned seeing the VASI at all. As I think about this accident, I just can't help but wonder why one or the other pilots at some point didn't just say, we're going around.
I wondered about that too, but I think in the one thing we can't forget is that this approach was in the middle of the night. And when you're flying in the middle of the night, I don't care how well rested you think you are, your brain is not operating at 100%. And it was clear all the way down that these two pilots were not getting along all that well together. I can't remember how often it said that they had flown together, but clearly the person in the right seat, who was no spring chicken at his age, was being led by a person who was much older, making it very difficult for him. He didn't seem to really want to be with the guy because he was very sarcastic and apparently very dramatic about basically, what are you doing? I don't know why you can't fly the airplane. All we need to do is fly the airplane, make the approach, and land. And that can build up an awful lot of tension in the person that's listening to this and trying to follow the instructions and then also fly the airplane.
Yeah, and in the transcript, there were notations such as in a frustrated tone, and I tried to convey that as we were reading through this. One of the things it tells us in the final NTSB report is that they did find the airbrakes deployed in the wreckage, so they were still deployed when they hit the ground. So the captain clearly did not have a good idea of where they were on the descent profile, even though the first officer apparently did when he said, no, that I am not low. And that, of course, was too late at that point. One of the other things that noted in the report was that the captain was not following the procedures. He gave no altitude call-outs. He should have been calling out the altitude at 1,000 feet, 500 feet, 100 feet, and then 50 feet to go to minimums. Perhaps that's because they didn't have the glide slope, and yet you would still think that he would make those call-outs. Yeah, and as you were talking about your approach into the airport in Georgia, I think that pilots can use a rule of thumb, which is for a 3-degree glide slope, you're going to be coming down about 320 feet per nautical mile. So if you're 10 miles out and there are no obstructions, then you know that you're going to have to be around 3,200 feet above the field elevation. Now, of course, that doesn't account for any obstructions that might be between you and the airport. But using that kind of mental math at night can help you figure out roughly where should I be if I don't have some type of vertical guidance to the airport. But of course, you really should have vertical guidance.
Well, and of course, one thing we haven't spoken about is that if they had gone around and flown the runway heading, they could have just entered a left downwind VFR and come back around and landed on that runway. But that was never even discussed because these two were having such a tense time interacting with each other. And I don't think either one was thinking very clearly, and they certainly they didn't seem to have a feel for what they were getting themselves into or how to get out of it.
Though at one point the captain said, I don't want you to kill me, which almost sounds like maybe there was a sense in the back of his mind that things were not going well in this flight.
Well, I think that when I've never used that with anybody myself, but I can only imagine that when somebody is saying something like that, they are really frustrated because they have spent an enormous amount of time trying to coax this person along who they think should already know how to fly the airplane and just doesn't seem to be getting it, can't seem to follow instructions, even though the instructions were well soaked with sarcasm, and that colors everything that goes on. And again, in your brain, it's not just hearing the instructions. It's this guy's just on my back, and I'd like to reach over and strangle him, and all that stuff takes brain power to even think about, and not when you're doing this, not when you're so close to the airport. And again, I think what really scared me is that once the gear was down, I don't care what airplane you're in, you never pull the speed brakes, you never pull the boards, because that increases the rate of descent so much. And again, with no visual perspective of whether they were high or low or whatever, I'm sure the last thing they were going to think about looking at was the vertical speed. And so again, they flew it right into the ground.
Yeah, and of course, by pulling the speed brakes, the captain violated the procedures in the POH. The NTSB also cited the captain for lack of leadership by saying that he failed to take over command or take over the flying responsibilities from the other pilot once he determined that the pilot was not performing well. In your experience, are pilots very reluctant to take over from the other pilot, even when things don't seem to be going well?
I think pilots would be very reluctant to take over. I mean, as a captain, you're trying to train the person in the right seat. So the last thing you want to do, because it's going to completely squash that person's confidence, is take the controls. I've got it. You just don't want to do that. But of course, what this transcript is also telling us is that the captain had really no situational awareness at all of what was going on. He was so busy trying to tell the person in the right seat that he didn't know what he was doing and that he was behind the airplane that, again, he missed a critical element. The gear's down, flaps are 40, and he's telling him to pull the brakes, to pull the speed boards out. My God. Again, this was just an accident waiting for it to happen. I mean, it was getting away from both of them very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think that since pilots usually alternate legs on trips like this, the idea that, hey, this is my leg and the last trip was your leg probably inhibits them a little bit from taking over when things aren't going well and saying, hey, I'm going to fly the airplane now. And so in that sense, the NTSB is probably right. The captain probably did abrogate some of his responsibilities. But it's amazing that we could have had pilots with both of whom had nearly 12,000 hours who made so many mistakes in this incident and yet didn't recognize that and just continued to fly on.
I think that comes from the fact that so many people say, I'm just flying the airplane. I mean, it's not going to hurt me. I mean, I know I'm not going to get killed. I'm not going to hurt myself, but I'm not happy with the way this is going. And I remember when I was still teaching primary students, I would tell them, this is a marvelous, that day or that lesson after you give them the controls and they can see they can move the ailerons left and right and the pitch moves the nose up and down. And they go, wow, this isn't so hard. And you want to make it fun for them, but you also need to communicate at some point that if you do not respect this machine and its limitations, it will take your life, or it could take your life.
Yeah, this accident really highlights how important it is to follow all of the procedures all the time. And when you start skipping some of them or doing them incorrectly, you put yourself at peril. Rob, thanks so much for helping us here today. Where do people find out more about you and your work?
Well, they will find me within the pages of many of the nation's aviation magazines and here and there, but also at jetwind.com, where Scott Spangler and I keep a blog going about aviation buzz and bold opinions about things happening in our industry. And we've been doing that. Thanks for asking, Max. We've been doing that since 2006. I can't believe it's going to be 18 years.
That's great. Rob, thanks so much for helping us out here today.
You betcha, Max. Anytime.
And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support. To support the show financially, you can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down. You can always